Hello, good evening, everyone. Sorry, we're starting a little bit late. Just want to welcome you to the June 27th version of Kidney Disease Editorial Edition with Kenneth Sorenson, and that's on the Urban Health Outreach Network. I appreciate everyone for joining us. Tonight, I want to start out by saying tonight's show is a lot about race in this country and how it's affected education, economics, and health of the minority communities. This is a very kind of delicate topic, one wouldn't have touched probably a few years ago. So please forgive me ahead of time if I misspeak. I did a lot of research, but I've never lived this kind of situation. I grew up in a middle class white family, and so I've never encountered a lot of the stuff that some other people have. But I would love to hear anyone's feedback on this topic. I can't see your comments as they happen, but I'll try to address them on the next show. So please comment or send me a message on Facebook. Yet again, it's Kenneth Sorenson. I'm from Goose Creek, South Carolina, which is right outside of Charleston. So send me a message there. My email address is KENSOREN at AOL.com. And I'd love to hear any emails you have about it too. So I want to start out by talking a little bit about how African Americans came to the United States. A lot of the focus of this is going to be on African American community because that's one of the largest that's dealing with kidney disease in this country. Why I'm going over the history is because I think it actually sets up kind of the major reason I feel like there's a disparity in African Americans and kidney disease in this country compared to other races. Um, uh, Almost every person of color is more prone to kidney disease by at least 1.2%, or 1.2 times what Caucasians or white people are. But as we'll talk about a little bit later, African Americans are even more prone to it. So let's start out a little bit of the history of it. So so how obviously African Americans came to this country was via slavery. The first slaves entered the United States in 1619 in Jamestown, Virginia. They were brought over by the Dutch, actually on Spanish ships, oddly enough. So, um, and Jamestown was the first American colony or English colony in what we know as the United States now. By the time the Constitution was ratified in 1783, slavery was a huge institution in the country. Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3 labeled slaves as three-fifths a person. The only reason the owners of slaves wanted that was for voting power. They could own, hundreds, thousands of slaves and them count as more people in a state. That way they got more representatives in the House of Representatives. If you think of a lot of the southern states that the majority of the slaves were in, they were mostly rural. And so there wasn't a lot of population as there was in Boston, New York, things like that. And so they wanted to count as many votes as they can. The problem is African Americans couldn't vote. They weren't actual people, um, according to the United States government at the time. In 1805, most of the northern states had already passed laws to effectively abolish slavery. Not all slaves were released in the North at the time, just a good amount of them were. Um, uh, but um, but the problem with that was the North had so few slaves that it didn't really make any dent in the abolition of slavery in general. The Jefferson administration in 1808 actually made it illegal to import slaves anymore. The problem with that's not a bad step, but the problem with that is it actually didn't help the slave population at all because there was always already so many in this country. They had already reproduced those kind of things, and their children or their children's children were now slaves in the country. So it didn't do much. In 1860, when Lincoln won the presidency, the South started seceding from the Union. My state, South Carolina, was the first one to do it, and but it was followed closely by a lot of other. The kind of the how it went is the more slaves that they had, the quicker they seceded because they knew Lincoln becoming president. One of his main platforms was abolishing slavery. Um, the Civil War began on April 12th, 1861. And Yet again, it involves my home state and actually the town I live in. The Fort Sumter was where the first shots of the Civil War were fired in Charleston, South Carolina. Interesting side note because I live here. No one died in the first battle. Actually, a horse was the only thing that died in the first battle. It was more symbolic. An important date, the next year, September 22nd, 1862, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. It abolished slavery in the United States. Interesting thing is, it didn't really do anything. It was also symbolic. The North had already fairly pretty much abolished slavery, and the South wasn't even a part of the country at the time. But it was a very strong gesture of Lincoln saying, "We're not going to give this up. So you guys can either lose this war or give up the slaves. It's up to you." Um, on the war ended in April 19th, 1865. And that's when that was happened at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. That's when the South surrendered. The Civil War actually didn't officially end for a couple of years because far off places like Texas and things like that at the time didn't hear about it because we didn't have the internet, things like that. December 6th, 1865, that's when slavery was actually abolished. The 13th Amendment was ratified by the number of states needed. And the 13th Amendment, what it says, what it kind of kind of a brief outline of it. It says, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crime, whereof the parties shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction." So that's when slavery was, I guess, officially ended. Obviously, it did not end right then. It went on for a few more years. The thing I want to point out about that segment of time is slavery officially ended, I guess, December 6th, 1865. But if you look in especially the rural South, things like sharecropping went on, and I mean, maybe some of it still goes on today, but the 60s, probably the 1960s, a good majority of that. So basically, 100 years later, African Americans in this country, a good bit of them were still pretty much slaves. Sharecropping is basically, you're renting land, you're making very little off of it, most of the time barely enough to live, if that. And and one thing we'll talk about when we talk about education in a little while um, is that you know when you have there's certain foundation that you need to be successful in education or in life. They call, I believe a psychiatrist named Maslow calls them his hierarchy of needs, and that the base foundation is safety, food, shelter, things like that. That doesn't even get into, the greater things like, I don't know, having a car or something crazy like that. That's just the basics of what you need to kind of survive and thrive in the world. So now let's talk a little bit about the next stage in the evolution of kind of race in this country. The next stage was, basically segregation time period, the Jim Crow laws, as they're kind of known. Particularly in the South, things like water fountains, restaurants, gas stations, movie theaters, things like that, were separate between the African Americans and the whites. This was a normal practice, as I said, particularly in the South, but it went on, in a good bit of the country. In 1897, there was a famous court case called Plessy versus Ferguson. And the Supreme Court, the highest court in the United States, said that segregation was legal as long as it was separate yet equal. We know this is crazy because it was far from equal. But that's what the Supreme Court said, and that was completely in place until actually until 1964. But the first major swing in that was in 1954 with Brown versus the Board of Education, which overturned the separate but equal doctrine, particularly in schools. So officially, segregation ended in schools in 1954. I have to say things like suspicious, officially, supposedly, those kind of things when I'm dealing with this, because uh, most of us that have looked into it realize that segregation is still happening in schools. It may not be it may not be forcibly, but it's definitely happening still. So so the first kind of the most recent kind of acts to help stem the tide of racism, and yet again, these attempts have helped, but it's far from been kind of the solution. And one thing I'll say throughout this is I definitely don't know the solution. I can see the problems clearly. But this people way smarter than me need to come up with the solutions. And I've definitely been trying to listen. At the Democratic debate last night, I listened to the whole thing, tried to find things that could hopefully, that I felt might change for people that are smarter than me, that know more about policy, know more about how to get things done in Washington, that kind of thing. But in 1964, it's kind of the legacy of John F. Kennedy was the Civil Rights Act. This legally ended segregation completely. It now made it illegal to segregate anything. In 1965, the Voting Rights Act allowed equal voting rights. Yet again, I still don't think there are equal voting rights, but that act was designed to provide those. Then in 1968, the Fair Housing Act. A lot of people, like even myself, didn't realize until I looked more into it over the last few years how difficult it is for people of color to even to find housing. They're discriminating against constantly, and yet again, that's one of those basic rights. And one of the basic rights of being a citizen of the United States is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And I definitely will be the first to admit that I don't think that people of color are given those opportunities, especially as much as they should. Um, so so we talked a little bit about the history. Now let's talk about in what's my opinion the kind of the greatest obstacle in the health side of the racial disparities. And I'm going to say I think that's education. One thing we talked a little bit about on the last show is that education is probably the single greatest factor in health in this country. The more people know, the better they take care of themselves, the more likely they are to go to doctors because doctors don't scare them. They know more what they're talking about, things like that. And with education, usually hopefully becomes a bit more prosperity. And in that, you are able to see better doctors. You have more access to insurance, those kind of things. So it's definitely not the panacea or the cure all to this issue, but I think education would be a huge step. And when I'm talking about education, obviously I'm talking about general education, but I'm also talking about education of kidney disease, hypertension, and diabetes. Though they're so prevalent in people of color that I think that more education could hopefully at least limit that a little bit. They've actually noticed a good bit of it in the African American community and particularly the Native American community. They're not preventing diabetes, but the more diabetes education there is, the less people they're finding that are ending up with kidney disease or other severe cases of diabetes, like the problem I have with my eye or gastroparesis or losing limbs, those kind of things are very common side effects of uncontrolled diabetes. So let's talk a little bit about education. So education for African Americans in this country for most of its existence was basically non-existent. Brown versus the Board of Education was supposed to change that. It should have integrated schools, but it's had very little effect in the end. Um, Particularly in the South. The African American population in general didn't live near the whites, so they were able to keep mostly white schools due to geography. Politicians also used methods called gerrymandering in order to make African American votes not count as much. It's still around. They're constantly making changes in voter lines and things like that to make it a little bit more fair, but it's definitely still going on, unfortunately. 50% of school children are in schools that are 75% of that 75% of their school is their same color. So that's half of the school children that 3/4 of their school look like them. One thing that lots of educators have found is the more diverse a school is, the better quality the school is, and therefore the better the education is. Here are some basic statements from the UNCF that are statements based off the Department of Education / Office of Civil Rights reports um, on particularly African American when it comes to school. All right, African American students are less likely than white students to have access to college ready courses. In fact, in the 2011 2012 school year, only 50% of Black students have access to the full range of math and science courses necessary for college readiness. compared to up to 81% of Asian American students and 71% of white students. So that means that they're starting at a disadvantage when it comes to even being prepared for college, which is a very sad fact. Statistic number two: even when Black students do have access to the honors or advanced placement courses, they are vastly underrepresented in these courses. Black and Latino students represent 38% of students in school that offer AP courses, but only 29% of the students enrolled in an AP course are Black or Latino. They also have less access to gifted and talented education programs than white students. And those gifted and talented programs, what those allow is to prepare them to get ready for college preparatory classes, advanced placement classes, those kind of things. So yet again, they're starting from a disadvantage. African American students are often located in schools with less qualified teachers, teachers with lower salaries, and novice teachers. My brother teaches at a predominantly African American school in this area, and he has told me that a lot of new teachers start at those schools because once people get experience, they leave to go to I guess I don't know, more affluent areas, and so in the end, he's a mentor teacher there. He's been at his school for about 12 years, and he has told me that he's having to basically train new teachers constantly because once people get experience, they leave. He told me he stays there because he feels like he can make the greatest impact at that school than he can even what he drives about an hour to work every day, just because he feels like he can make more of an impact on those students than he can in the I guess more affluent, more I don't know, or less racially diverse schools. He feels like he can make a good impact on them. So, statistic number three is African American students are off. Oh, sorry. Statistic number four. I'm sorry. Our research has shown evidence of systematic bias in teachers' expectations for African American students, and non-Black teachers were found to have lower expectations of Black students than Black teachers have for them. So they're not pushing them as hard because they have a mental idea that they can't handle as much, and because of that, they're not teaching them as much as someone of their same race, which obviously puts them at another disadvantage. And the fifth statistic, I think there was 10. I'm only giving you five. African American students are less likely to be college ready. In fact, 61% of ACT tested Black students in 2015 high school's graduating class met none of the four ACT college readiness benchmarks, nearly twice the 31% of the rest of the students. So ACT and SAT are the big measuring blocks to get into college. African American students are at a 61% rate of not meeting any of the four standards for college benchmark readiness. And other races are at about 31%, so almost half of half of the failure rate. So one of the major reasons I wanted to list all the history and the stats was to point out how unequal our free society actually is. If I had to be completely honest, I didn't see the extent of it until I got sick. I would go to hospitals and dialysis centers, and I would see more people of color than I would of people that looked like me. And I live in a mostly white slash Asian community. So why is the majority of the people there of usually African American or Latino uh, ancestry? And so I talked to people that I really respected about why. We started talking about education and economics. Slavery technically ended in 1865, but the effects are still very evident. People of color make way less money on average. They are also educated far less, and even the justice system is stacked against them. I talked about diabetes last week, which is the major cause of kidney disease, and people of color are twice as likely to have it. Kidney disease is an epidemic, period, but it also affects people of color at such an alarming rate. Some statistics specifically on that are um, African Americans are four times as much likely to get kidney failure. And as I believe Steve told me, I don't know where he got the statistic, but 9 out of 10 African Americans have kidney disease, and most of them do not know it. And so it's a pretty alarming amount of people. While Asian Americans make up about 13% of the population, they account for 35% of the people with kidney failure. I'm sorry, African Americans, sorry, make up 13% of the population, and they account for 35% of the people with kidney failure in the United States. And obviously, we talked about diabetes and high blood pressure are the major causes of this. Uh, Hispanics, you know, there a growing number of Hispanics are diagnosed with kidney disease each year. About since 2000, the number of Hispanics uh, have increased by 70%, and they're about 1.3 times more likely to contract kidney disease or get kidney disease than your average white person. So that's pretty incredible. Also, Native Americans are 1.2 times more likely, and they're a very small part of the population these days. But think about that number. That's pretty huge. So like some of the things I want to talk about too is I want to talk about how one of the things that's so important, and Steve and I were talking about this earlier about the Urban Health Outreach Network is you've got a diverse group of people that are all talking about a disease that's affected us in some way. I mean, I know some people have had two transplants. I just had mine in February. There's some people that are kind of in the early stages of kidney disease that are talking about it, that kind of thing. Then you have, the founder of the network, Steve, that, was a dialysis nurse for a very long time. And so he knows it from that perspective. Obviously, those of us that have been, that had transplants or had kidney disease, a lot of us knows the side from the dialysis patient, that kind of thing. And one of the things Steve and I talked about was, just finding a way to get the word out. Even if this network or this show is able to help one person, I definitely think it's an important thing for us to kind of look into. That one person, if we could save that one life, we're all doing, none of us are getting paid for this. We're doing this out of the love of, just helping people and wanting to save lives. One thing I will say, though, is one thing I think we need to pay attention to in our next election, no matter what side of the aisle you're on, is the healthcare issue. The number one one of the people last night on the debate is one of the foremost bankruptcy lawyers in the country, and one of the things she said was medical expenses is the number one reason people have to file for bankruptcy. Think about that. One of the number one reasons to file for bankruptcy is medical expenses. So we have to find a way to either fix the system we have or create a system that is fair for everyone. I'm not really sure what the argument is as to why we shouldn't have health care for everyone in this country. But um, either way, I think that um, we need to look into figure out a way. Some of the people I've heard want to limit pharmaceutical companies. That'd be awesome. That's a great idea. The amount of money they make, and I might do my next show on that. Is the pharmaceutical companies in the United States. One of the things to keep in mind is the amount of money they're making is obscene. Just off of the opioid crisis, the amount of money they've made is obscene. Those of us that are, have been around dialysis and things like that know the amount of money that pharmaceutical companies, dialysis companies make off of our lives, keeping us trying to quote unquote keeping us alive. And so I think it's pretty ridiculous. A lot of people would say that the plans for universal health care that Scandinavia has, or England or Canada, wouldn't work here. And I guess my point to that would be, let's try something, because what we have is not working. People are making way too much money off of it, and I just, I'm okay. I believe capitalism's okay when under control. But I also think that there's certain industries like education, maybe prisons, maybe healthcare, shouldn't be that much profit from it. I just feel like it really affects people's lives, and I think that we need to do what's best for the people in the country. That's the ultimate goal of government, I think. So what I'm thinking in the next few weeks is maybe doing a show on the pharmaceutical companies. I also am trying to get the lady that donated her kidney to me to have her talk a little bit about it. And I'm going to be honest. I'm going to ask her honest questions. I don't want her to just be sunshines and rainbows, because I know she's had a few struggles since she's given me her kidney, and and we'll see if we can get that out of her. She's not the kind of person to complain a lot, so we'll see if we can get that out of there. I think I'm gonna try to have maybe an author on at some point, to talk about his book about his struggle with kidney disease and his first transplant. So I've got a few things in the works. I'm trying my best to bring topics that I'm passionate about, and I hope everyone else finds it interesting too. But I think part of my role in my show is to not only give you facts and stuff, but also give you opinions about things I'm very passionate about. I want to end on this note. As I said, I think education in general, but particularly diabetes, hypertension, are key to saving lives. Let's focus on spreading the word of kidney disease, but even more importantly, let's spread the word of equality. That is what really saves lives. I think that accepting everyone and loving everyone and treating them how you'd want to be treated is an important part of what we're doing here, in urban outreach media. I think and it's definitely a goal of my show is to kind of bring awareness to the struggles that everyone has, not just one particular group of people, but everyone has when we're trying to face this horrible disease of kidney disease. And I hope to have you guys continue to watch. Next week will be July 4th. I'm actually going to take that day off to spend some time with the family. So I'll see you, I guess, in 2 weeks, which will be July 11th. And we'll do it at the same time from 8 to 8:30 or ish, 8 to 8:30 ish. Steve's giving me a little bit of wiggle room. But I really hope to see you. I hope everyone has a great holiday week. And let's think about ways where we can be proud to be Americans and try to fix the things that need to be fixed in order to make us the greatest country in the world again. Thank you very much, and I'm signing off for tonight. And thank you for watching Kidney Disease Editorial Edition with Kenneth Sorenson. This is your June 27th show. Thank you very much, and have a good night. Bye.